Hello, everyone. Welcome on this wonderful Wednesday for a fantastic topic that we're going to talk about that's on everyone's minds, perspective of generative AI and the transformation that's happening across talent acquisition and recruiting due to this phenomenal technology and what we're seeing today. My name is Amit Bhatia. I'm your host for today, and I work at Data People. I'm the CEO of Data People. We bring recruiting intelligence and control, and our goal is to transform talent leaders into strategic partners in their organization by giving them the tools, the intelligence and control they need to meet those hiring goals. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. I personally am on a mission to live in a world where every candidate who applies to a job has the same chance at getting that job as somebody who came in through a referral or a warm introduction. I want to live in a world where there is genuine equity. And I think AI can be a huge accelerant to that process. It can be a huge deterrent to that process. So I'm excited to get into that today with Tim and with Rachel. And a little bit about Data People, just a 5-minute spiel. We're bringing science to the hiring process. What Data People does is 3 things. It helps you engage all of your stakeholders. I'm sure you've heard about candidate experience. What we're focused on is hiring manager experience and how do we make them part of your process. We help you calibrate your content so that it wins and it's market ready so that you're getting the right candidates. And we help talent teams measure accurately and efficiently across your whole pipeline. So how you can recruit more scientifically all the way through. And as we get into it, what we're starting to see is a huge demand for our technology, and you're going to hear some from Rachel as well, as to how do you respond to AI. Our customers, our users are very excited about generative AI. They're using it in lots of different places. And where Data People can often be placed is a guardrail. When you're using tools that might be more generally trained, how do we make sure that no matter how you write, where you write, that those job descriptions, that recruiting content is compliant, it's inclusive, it's welcoming to everybody, and it's trained on the right sets of data. And that's what we make sure. We have AI baked through our app in lots of different ways. And I'd love to tell you more about it, in separate conversations. So today, with no further ado, I wanted to introduce our panelists, Tim and Rachel. Tim, you've been talking about this forever. You've been really passionate, a huge passionate and advocate of this space. Tell us a little bit about you and what's your favorite song in international music today?
My favorite song, I don't have a favorite song. I love all music. So like my last 4 concerts, literally in order, Justin Bieber before he got like his voice issue, and people go, oh my gosh, Believer. And again, a catalog that is amazing. And then I went to Luke Combs, so big country star. And then I saw Taylor Swift, and then I saw Janet Jackson. And so literally, like I have this country, pop, R&B. I grew up with parents that were like country music singers and I hated it. So I immediately went to like rap and hip hop 80s. And then it's just kind of grown. And then I'm back to country again. Like I love country music for some reason. Like, I don't know, like I'm all over the place.
Janet Jackson is so underrated.
I was front row with Janet. I literally told my wife if she would have spun too hard, I would have got Janet Jackson sweat all over me.
So, Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've been passionate about this. You've been passionate about talent acquisition.
Yeah.
How have you been seeing, this whole evolution?
I'm definitely like a technocrat. Like I love recruiting technology in general, right? So all of the automation, everything that makes us better. In this evolution from like machine learning, deep learning into kind of like conversational generative AI, I just have this feeling like, again, all of this is the future of what we're trying to do. And I'm really bullish on it. Like, I'm not one of those kind of doomsdayer, like, oh my gosh, the robots are going to take over and kill us. I saw today, like there was that like 41% of some CEOs at some Bloomberg thing were like, yeah, in the next 5 to 10 years, AI actually might destroy the earth. And I'm like, come on, like that's how ignorant like a lot of these CEOs are. Like they don't truly understand technology. And then we're asking them like, what do you think? And they're just like, oh yeah, the robots are going to kill us. It's not really what's going on. And so like, I'm super excited. I think I take a look at it as, what if we could all have a personal assistant in our life, right? To go and do the groceries and pick up our dry cleaning and make sure the bills were paid. Like, wouldn't that be amazing? Well, like generative AI has the ability of, what if we had a personal assistant in every single aspect of our life that was specifically trained for that aspect, and it was better than everybody else in the world at that aspect. So I want concert tickets. I'm going to have a personal assistant that will just focus on concert tickets. I want to be a better partner. I'm going to have a personal assistant that will help me, nudge me, engage me to be a better partner. Like physically, mentally, spiritually, every part. And then also professionally, right? And we can do that as recruiters, we can do that as HR professionals. So super bullish on what AI is going to bring to us.
And Rachel, welcome. Tell us a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about Fountain, and of course, about your favorite artists.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the most important thing, favorite artist. For me, it has to be Bruce Springsteen. And favorite song of his, Thunder Road, I would say. So I wish I could match Tim with the number of concerts I've been to in the last 6 months, but as I was telling these folks earlier, that number is 0. So we're gonna aim to get it at least up to 1 by the end of the summer. I'm optimistic. But I'm the VP of marketing at Fountain. Thank you all so much for having me. Fountain is a labor ATS designed specifically for high volume hourly hiring. And we're really focused on this idea that for so long, we have been trying to fit sort of the square peg of a corporate ATS into the round hole of hourly hiring, and the acknowledgement that different populations of workers need different things. And one of the reasons we're so excited about AI is because it does create new opportunities in increasing the equity of hiring and in breaking down some of the barriers that might traditionally exist for your average hourly worker out there applying for, say, 15 to 20 jobs at a time in a very different environment than the average knowledge worker.
It's so important. And I appreciate that it's about sort of thinking about sort of the kinds of tools that you need for different use cases. And the thing that frustrates me, talent it's always been this whole like, this hand-me-down approach to tooling in the talent acquisition space. Oh, why don't you use this tool that we're using somewhere else? And we're finally getting to this place in our ecosystem where we're recognizing that talent acquisition is a critical lifeblood of our organizations, and they need their own dedicated tooling. We need to treat them like the strategic partners that they are. And so a little bit about, I wanted to give you, before we got into our panel discussion today, I wanted to give you a little background on what we're seeing in the market, what we're seeing in data, and how it's affecting it. And in the last 4 years, I have to say, my goodness, talent acquisition professionals and leaders have had to become the superheroes of their organizations. First, it was like, oh my God, it's a pandemic, everyone go home. And then everyone come back to the office. And then we have pay transparency regulations, changes in compliance. The market got incredibly tight. The market got loose. We had to cut half our staff. It has just been a roller coaster, and the roller coaster never ends. And I was actually with our customer advisory board this morning, and I asked all of these incredible leaders from Fortune 500 companies. I asked them, so is the market getting easier? Is it easier to hire? And they're like, no, it's getting harder. It's always hard. It is always incredibly hard. And market data is incredibly difficult. So I thought, we have access to an incredible amount of data. Let's start with, where are we in the market? So the first thing, we live in these incredibly interesting times. It's true that we're starting to see the tightest labor market in history start to ease up and start to go back to, not ease up, just go back to pre-pandemic levels. Like that wasn't tight enough already.
Yeah, Amit, by the way, pre-pandemic, like 2019, 2018, were also historically low unemployment numbers.
Exactly. It was that was the tightest market I'd ever seen before the years that followed.
One extreme to another.
Yeah,
exactly.
Everything is always unprecedented. We just live in perpetually unprecedented times.
That is the best way to put it. And it's kind of nuts. So I asked ourselves in our data, like, where are we still seeing pockets of tightness, and where are we seeing that ease? And across the board, what we started to see is frontline roles are incredibly tight. So this is the average number of inbound applicants a job gets. And on average, an inbound applicant today gets about 40 applicants. That is not a lot. That is not, you think, oh my goodness, we're going to be flooded with hundreds of applications. Very, very few jobs out there get hundreds of applications. And when you deal with some healthcare jobs, you do production jobs, sometimes you're getting 15, 10 applications. It is hard, it is expensive, it is real work. And even in corporate jobs, you're seeing go-to-market jobs continue to are really tight, and G&A and tech started to ease up. And so you've got suddenly your talent acquisition professionals are in two different headspaces. You've got a huge sort of starting to get big volumes in one area. You're starting to do massive amounts of sourcing in the other area. And you've got to use different playbooks simultaneously, which is very unusual at most organizations. And what's happening more than ever is that, data people, 1 in 3 jobs are resulting in no hires. And that is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly challenging because it puts so much pressure on your organization to try to make efficiency work, to try to make sort of your projects work. If a third of any project you worked on just was doomed to fail, like everything has to be from a capacity planning position has to be different. And enter this wonderful promise of a new future, this new tool. All this while, the talent acquisition professional and their tooling has been treated a little bit like an admin assistant instead of treated like the superheroes that they are. They've been asked to do all sorts of, incredibly difficult, challenging, painstaking tasks, and enter that personal assistant, if you will. And no wonder there's interest, there's demand, there's this incredible optimism for the future in a way that hasn't been. We're already seeing it referenced in 2,000 plus jobs. You're starting to see it in like all sorts of jobs. UI UX developer, where you're asking for generative AI experience and prompt engineering experience. We're seeing it in jobs like, in content marketing and executive assistants. You're starting to see it. We've actually started to see it in a few talent acquisition jobs where like, are you comfortable using tools like ChatGPT? It's just like I still like roll my eyes when I see it in Microsoft Office show up in job descriptions, but ChatGPT is a lot more useful, or OpenAI, or any of these tools is a lot more useful to be asking for. Are you at least playing around with them? Are you starting to get familiar with how to make them work for you? We're starting to see very interesting use cases. Like some companies, these are all real actual jobs, by the way. Some companies asking, we need somebody to be a subject matter on legal prompt engineering. And that scares me. I mean, Tim, I'm sure you remember, like, what is it, last week, this lawyer used ChatGPT and it made up a whole bunch of cases. My goodness. You're going to see really, really interesting ways in which this shows up in job descriptions and the way this shows up in the way we operate. But the way I think about generative AI today is it's not one, but it's actually 3 completely different innovations. The first is the ability to understand user intent. Like we can actually, instead of those horrible chatbots of the past where you could like pick 1 of 4 options and go through this complex tree of nonsense, we can actually have a more natural and human conversation. And you can react to user content. And that was just magical. Like you can actually have a conversation or simulate a conversation. The least interesting of them is actually the ability to generate user readable content dynamically, or to be able to generate. It's fascinating, but it's probably only one of the 3 big innovations that we're seeing out of this technology. So with that brief introduction, Tim, Rachel, I want to get your take. How do you see these 3 different innovations, and what is the state of the world you see them today?
Rachel, go ahead.
Sure, kicking off with a big question. I think the user intent piece is one of the most interesting because it implies a certain level of knowledge from the user when they are approaching the tool. And I think that's the area where we're really still at the beginning stages, right? It's not necessarily that AI isn't capable of doing X, Y, or Z. It's, do we understand well enough what our own intentions are when we approach it in order to make it a productive and useful tool? And so I think that's where we're standing sort of at the beginning of the race, if you will. And of course, we've got, folks who are further ahead in that, those who are further behind. But as with anything, and I have a data and analytics background myself, and the thing that we always used to say at one of my past orgs about analytics is that it's not a destination, it's a journey. And similarly, like user intent and becoming comfortable with generative AI, it's not that you start out with a specific end goal in mind, and once you have achieved that, period, you're done. You don't need the tool anymore. It's more about understanding how to utilize it in an ever evolving landscape and understanding, okay, what are the questions that I need to be asking? What are the questions I need to ask myself? What are the questions that I need to ask as a TA or HR leader to potential services I might be looking at using, and making sure that there's a foundation of knowledge that I think, because we're so early on in the process, doesn't necessarily exist yet in an industry-wide way.
Tim, I'm kind of curious, like the promise of AI feels like it's been in our space for like 20 years. For the last 20 years, tools have been calling themselves the latest AI innovation. And what's kind of incredible is this one innovation in the last year has almost rendered everything before it a little bit obsolete.
Yeah.
So how have you seen this sort of, where is the most exciting place where we're using these sorts of tools today?
I do think it's because we go back to that chatbot 1.0, let's call it, right? Where it was somebody comes to your career site and they go, oh, I'm looking for, do you have a second shift job open in Memphis, Tennessee, right? And it would go, what is your name? And you're like, no, I just want to know, do you have any jobs in Memphis? What is your name? It's like, no, how much do you pay for that job? What is your name? And it only had one thing it could do. And people would get frustrated. It was funny to see the comments behind because they would get so angry, right, with this chatbot. And the chatbot's literally just some dumb machine doing its thing. And now, the advent of this chatbot, conversational AI 2.0, it understands oh, well, here's 3 different positions we have in Memphis. Would you like me to help you apply? Right. And then it was oh no, I was just kind of wondering what, how much do you pay? And it would go, oh, it's dependent on blah, blah, blah. And they would go, no, really, I want to know how much you pay. And they wouldn't come back with the exact same, kind of answer. It would come back with another one, all of which, by the way, are still pre-done answers. It's not making up the answer on its own. It's understanding what you're asking. It's giving you an answer of potential of, tens of thousands of answers that are built into the system. Right. And so I think that's a huge advancement when we see that from a use case standpoint. And I think when people start to think about, oh, okay, well, that's just still one little thing. I was talking with somebody the other day who's an AI professor at Stanford, and he's like, it's literally the limit of your imagination of potentially where this could go. So you see one use case. The reality is it's unlimited use cases across HR. I tell people all the time, imagine the employee experience use case for generative. Right now, an employee calls and he says Rachel, hey, this is Tim. How many PTO hours do I have? And you go 52, thanks, bam. And we both think that's a successful outcome, where generative would go, why is Tim asking for PTO? Maybe he wants to go on vacation. Maybe we should help him. We have corporate hotel discounts. Maybe Tim has a sick parent that he's trying to take care of and we need to get FMLA involved. There's so much that when you start to open up the box, you go, holy crap, this could do more than we ever thought of,
That's exactly right. Well, on that note, why don't we ask our audience what they think? So Brad, do you want to launch the poll and let's see what people's take are on the state of generative AI today?
So as we're waiting for those numbers to come in, I'll tell you, I was at SHRM National, right, last week. It was 25,000 HR people. I spoke. I had a room of 1,000, and I asked, raise a hand, who has used ChatGPT, Bard, any of the generative tools? Maybe 10%. And these are kind of in the weeds, HR people, right? And so it's still fewer than what we would think, even though the growth of chat alone, GPT alone, has been massive,
Well, that's exactly an interesting point, because along that similar vein, a couple of weeks ago, I was at an advisor event down in Dallas, and I asked not who was utilizing, but how optimistic do you feel? And just had folks raise their hand, 1 for no confidence, 5 for very confident. And to my surprise, it was all 5s in the room from these, CHROs. But then it came to the question, right, as you said, Tim, of, are you using it today? Or how do you use it today? And it went from, well, we're really excited about it, to we're not entirely sure how to make the most use of it, right? So there's a lot of optimism, but not necessarily practical understanding yet of what do we do with this tool.
Yeah, the biggest question I get is tell me today, practical use of how to actually use it. And I think that's one of the things we'll talk about. One of the challenges is for most TA people, for most HR people, they're going to see this as features in the technology that they have. That's how it's going to show up to begin with,
That's right.
And then in I try to tell people it's the frog in the boiling water story, right? Where if you put a frog in a pot of water and you braise it up 1 degree an hour, it'll boil itself alive because it doesn't realize the environment's changing around it. If you try to put a frog in boiling water, it'll immediately jump out because it's too hot. One day we'll wake up and we'll go, AI, open the curtains and have the coffee ready. And oh, by the way, there is coffee there because AI knew my coffee was running low. And we don't realize that this thing is always within a handshake, like it's biased all the time, you know? And AI is very similar. Like one day we'll wake up and be surrounded by it and we won't really realize how it happened.
So we're getting some results right here. So, wow, I'm surprised. 25% of people already say we use it regularly. And folks, if there is anybody who uses it every day, please, I'd love to hear from you in the chat where you use it every day and how it's showing up in jobs. We're hearing about 50% of people are saying we've experimented it, but we don't use it regularly, which is not surprising. We've got, I'm very impressed to say no one said that the company has banned AI use. So that's a really good sign, because I have to say, it feels like we're different than 5-6 years ago. But we do have a number of, but 10% of people who say we don't have a policy about it. Nobody talks about it. No education is happening. And that is surprising as well. So I'm kind of curious about this. I have to say, like, there's, on that last point, something shifted. I remember for the last 10 years when AI-based tools were starting to come about, CHROs, talent leaders were automatically like, no, we're not comfortable. This is, we're losing a lot of control. And it's an organization which, it's a group of people that already don't, have to manage a really complex kind of operation. I understand that reticence. In the last year with ChatGPT, certainly this feels like there's been a bit of a change where they're not the ones saying no. It might be legal saying no. It might be compliance saying no. It might be finance saying no. But the CHRO is not saying no anymore. And that's itself a huge mind shift that's happening in the way we think about this in our economy. So a few questions were asked, which is, where's the low-hanging fruit for the people who are using it? Some of our customers have been saying that sourcing Boolean string are wonderful ways. So you got a job, you got a candidate pool. How do you very quickly generate a Boolean string? Tim, Rachel, any other examples come to your mind as to where people are starting to use this regularly?
Yeah, I see it in like personalized outreach, right? So, I mean, I think that's one of the difficult pieces of, you're a recruiter, you source a list of 25 people and you don't want to send them one email that's the same email for all 25, right? You want to be able to take a look at their profile, take a look at the job, piece some things together, and then send out a real personal message to every single person. Well, capacity-wise, that would be difficult to do. And generative, in a lot of the tools that we're seeing as features in a lot of the sourcing tools out there, some of the ATS stuff that's out there, you're starting to see that where it's like, okay, yeah. And again, the caveat is you still have to approve it, right? Hey, boom, within seconds, here's the message. And then you can go through, make sure it sounds what you want, and then boom, send. But now I can actually send 25 really personalized messages that talk about where they work, their education, their location, whatever it might be. And they go, holy crap, this recruiter actually put some time into like understanding who I am at least, right? And maybe you cut through the noise with stuff like that.
Yeah, I found two really good places where this is a powerful tool. The first is summarization. You've got a complex piece of data set, a complex piece of, and how do you like distill it down into something that you can send in a Slack message to your boss? Again, but the very important, if you're going to send it to your boss, like Tim said, human in the loop, you got to approve it. You got to take responsibility for it. But the second was also this, exactly what you pointed out, Tim, the cold start problem. So often we're not writers. Like, it is a hard writing, like, so if you're writing something that is disposable, that is relatively quick, that's relatively, one-off, it's a wonderful way of dealing with the cold start problem. Someone on the chat, Chris X, says, using it for sourcing strings, job description development, interview question.
I do love like when you take, because most people still, like, here's the problem we have in our industry is like most, and again, I'd say most, like, I don't know what the exact percentage is. A great deal of TA professionals will still cut and paste a job description as a job posting, right? And on their career site. And easy enough, you can upload that into chat and ask it to say, write an actual interactive job posting or a job advertisement that's going to get people interested, or, and again, it'll come back with something that's actually, it's better than a job description. It might not be perfect. Now, again, does it have, is it reducing bias? Is it making it inclusive? All of those things. No, you'd have to again prompt more. And I know, like, what you guys have at Data People have some of that stuff already built in with some of those bumpers, right? Which I think is really important. But for those who are out there just testing it, you'd be shocked at how great a really boring 40 bullet job description can be turned into an actual really decent kind of job posting through GPT in the matter of like seconds. You know, one of the things I love about GPT and Bard, you know how it kind of like takes, it seems like it's thinking and it starts typing and it's going like little by little, line by line. They actually did that because as humans, we didn't want to see it all pop at once. Even though in a microsecond, it could pop everything on there at once, it actually types it out. So we have this feeling like there's some robot behind the scenes actually thinking about this.
Well, it's funny you say that, because we intentionally designed that in for Fountain AI as well, to make sure that as you're getting the response, it feels like, there's something.
Oh, they're really taking their time to think about this one.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to add to that job description idea, right, one of the things that, we are looking into is that idea of using it to understand, is there bias that exists within a certain job description? Does it use language that is considered more aggressive, or that would be considered ableist, right? Which particularly, given that we work specifically in the hourly space, when you're talking about, jobs that might require heavy lifting, things like that, like how are you describing what is needed for this job? And then additionally, getting into the interview and screening process, again, a lot of what we work with, it's a very binary set of questions, right? Like, are you over 18? Do you have a driver's license? Like those types of things that there's no reason that a human should be spending their time like combing through those things, right? We had someone who took, their time to hire from 21 hours to 2 hours just by implementing the simple, like, allow humanity to be augmented, right? Not replaced, but TA teams are stretched, right? HR teams are stretched, and any place that there can be an opportunity to make the job easier and focus on the actual aspects that require the human touch, we should be fully embracing that.
That's right. Bob makes on the chat, by the way, the chat's lighting up. And I have to say, the examples that I'm hearing and I'm seeing from people are fantastic. So I wanted to highlight a few great examples. There was an example, which was my favorite one from Amy, which is coming up with names for fun Slack channels. Boy, is that hard. So well done, Amy. That's a fantastic use case. Another one, which I really liked, was also by another Amy, was on using it for research. So often, it's so hard for recruiters to have to do an enormous amount of research. And research is hard, it's time consuming, you don't get rewarded for doing research. But I will say there is one pitfall. And I want to show you an example of that pitfall. It's sometimes you do that research and you get it wrong a lot. Let's say you want to do a research about a candidate and the AI just sounds so confident. For example, I gave ChatGPT my own LinkedIn profile, and it did such a beautiful, confident job of talking about this wonderful Amit Bhatia, who I'm very jealous of, by the way. It looks very similar, sounds very similar to me, but not the right person. And this is the problem. You
gave him the link. Yeah, here's the actual link of who I am.
It could have just said, "Hey, Amit, I can't read this link," or whatever. But no, and this is where you've got to be especially careful when you're doing research, is because that research can just go off in a completely wrong direction. I know, Tim, you've got a cool anecdote about this as well.
Yeah, I did a presentation to ask, like, what is the most controversial quote that, thought leader Tim Sackett has ever said, and it came back with, "Don't hire ugly people because they'll lower the value of your organization."
Oh my God. Please tell me you didn't say that.
And I did not say that. It was totally hallucinated. Now, so I did ask for where the source came from, and it went back to like a 2013 blog post that I made as a joke around hiring pretty people, because you go into some companies, you're like, is the main criteria you just hire beautiful people? Like, what's going on here? And so I made the comment in that post about you should hire more pretty people because they'll raise the value of your organization. For whatever reason, it totally turned it around on the negative side and then put it as like, yeah, this is the most controversial quote. And I'm just like, well, I never said that. And it was also said in jest. What I did actually say, I always tell people though, within terms of the hallucinations or the research that we do, because I do a ton of research using GPT, and I always have to ask myself, like, does my gut feel like this potentially could be right? If it doesn't, I'll really start to like prompt and dig in. Where's the source from? Where did, and then the other prompt that I love to use is I ask GPT a lot of, take a look at the answer you just gave me and tell me where you got it wrong. And it's shocking at how it will actually go through and say, well, on point 3, If I look, it'll come back and say, actually show you where it may be hallucinated. But you have to prompt it to do that, right? And it's learning like every child does. But I tell people all the time, like, if Rachel sent me something tomorrow and said, hey, Tim, I got this great report from Fountain. And I'm like, and it was like, you should only hire white dudes. I would be like, that doesn't sound right. Like I might start digging in and asking, right? So it's the same experience if you believe somebody's sending you something. I might have the best relationship with Rachel. I might know she has the best data, but if it doesn't feel right in my gut, I'm probably going to start to ask more questions, do a little more research. You should never take anything anybody tells you, let alone an AI engine, and say, oh, automatically it's 100% true, right?
That's right. One of the points that I thought was really insightful in the chat was by Bob, who was talking about how to maximize efficiency, you need integration with the ATS and the CRM, and you need controlled and compliant. And I think that's exactly right. It's also one of the reasons why a very general purpose tool like ChatGPT is useful, but only to a degree and limit. For example, when you're dealing with very highly controlled documents like a job description that has compliance requirements, the brand compliance as well as regulatory compliance, where you want to have an enormous amount of control, and it's not a cold start problem, it's a much riskier proposition to then have to validate what kinds of hallucinations might show up. And it also doesn't integrate well, it doesn't check well. So that's where guardrails become really important. Data People does exactly that. We provide guardrails for that purpose in closely integrated to your applicant tracking system. So you can always, wherever you're getting the content from, whether it's from an old job description or from ChatGPT, you're making sure it's complete, it's consistent, it's compliant, it's unbiased. But this brings up a question. The other part of the concern with tools like ChatGPT is also, what are they trained on and what data are they going to get of mine? And I can see, like, even when there's an excitement, security officers are like, hey, hang on a second. Are you sending our data up to OpenAI, and are you comfortable? And how do you do that? Now, Rachel, Fountain incorporated Fountain AI recently into your product set. How do you manage that problem well?
Yeah, so there is a difference between what you utilize, right, when you are building a tool or building a feature within a product, and then what happens to data that is input through the utilization of that feature. And so for us, everything remains closed within our system. But to your point, I think where we can get into sticky territory is with the excitement around tools and opportunities like this, that folks tend to rush ahead perhaps, or assume it's probably fine, right? Like the natural assumption that, oh, well, it's just, it all exists, within ChatGPT. I'm sure it's fine. And that is where I think it becomes so important to lock in the compliance. And, essentially, I think what we need to avoid as an industry, and when we look at generative AI in general, is what we ended up with in terms of GDPR back in like 2018. It took decades to get to a point, even just in the EU of data and privacy regulation. And then we're still seeing that only so slowly coming about in the US, but it lays the groundwork of sort of how not to go about this, how not to think about it, because there was such a gold rush that it wasn't until decades later that there was the appropriate compliance and the appropriate legal regulation in place to control it and keep it safe for everyone who's utilizing it.
I think people discount the amount of energy, effort, and work that's gone into actually producing GPT and BART, right? The large language model, obviously, they uses the internet based on a certain time period. The reality is it took years and years and years to develop. And when we think of like the silence we're hearing right now out of the big HCMs like Oracle, Workday, SAP, part of that is we know eventually they'll develop private language models that they'll work on. It takes a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort to put those together. And then you'll start to see major kind of, I think, things happen within the HR tech landscape of that are, because we'll have that comfort these aren't just pulling random things, right? They're going to be built on the legal example, right? You're going to have a legal technology that comes out that says, hey, this is what our model's built on. People think though that it can just happen overnight because it's AI. It'll just happen immediately. And you're like, no, it's so difficult to put a language model together, and there's so much work, and it just doesn't happen overnight. It takes testing. Like we're using GPT-4 right now. They started testing that 9 or 10 months ago.
That's right.
And it takes a long time for those things to come out and actually feel somewhat confident, and they're not even that confident.
it does feel like we're in the first 2 years of the App Store.
Yeah.
I remember distinctly, you had all of these, every app rushed to incorporate it. Every app felt kind of cool and different. It was so much fun. There was the Budweiser beer app that you could kind of do cool things with. And then over time, it got a lot more serious. Then you started to see the real innovations come through. You started to see the Ubers and all of these cool things you could do with your phone and transform it into a computational device. And I suspect it's going to be, we're still in the gimmicky phase of AI in some senses,
Yes.
right? We're cleansing out some of the really dumb AI pieces of tooling that we've been building in the last 10 years as an industry, and starting to ask, where do we want exceptional AI? Where do we want guardrails? Where do we want humanity? Where do we want? And it's going to get some trial and error as an industry to get it right. But over the next 5 to 6 years, you're going to start to see some real sort of innovations in terms of use cases come about in our space.
One of the bigger ones I think we start to freak out about is this whole kind of selection, right? I was on a panel with a Stanford kind of AI professor, and he made a comment. It was very straightforward, and most of the people in the room were HR people. Like, they literally, if you were to ask them before he said the comment, they would have said the exact opposite. His comment was, anytime you add AI into a process, you eliminate bias or reduce bias. Anytime you add humans into a process, you increase bias. And you hear the gasp in the crowd because they don't want to believe that. They want to believe that AI is racist. They want to believe AI is biased, that AI is sexist. No, we teach it to be that. But I can also audit and test for that. I can't audit Jim, the hiring manager, his racism or his sexism will come out at any moment that I don't know. I can actually figure that out with AI. So when people talk about, oh, you can never have AI select candidates or match candidates or do any of this, I'm like, I actually would be more comfortable with that than I would the other thing.
I think
I'm a huge Michigan State guy. I hate Michigan. So when I see a resume and someone has University of Michigan on it, I'm like, ugh. Like, it's the dumbest bias ever. It's a great school. It's a top 10 school. There's smart people. My son graduated from there. And still I go, blue. Like, that's the dumb human bias. AI would never do that.
Yeah. And it's easy to fix the AI bias. You can't. It's much harder to tell a human being, hey, man, you're kind of being biased here. Yeah. And you got to change your behavior. Behavior change is hard. But there is one element of distinction I draw, though, Tim, which is humans tend to be biased in ways that we've started to better understand as a society, right? We know that there's an enormous amount of inequity, and the biases that we have often exacerbate that inequity. In the early days of AI, with the kinds of training, without understanding the kind of training data sets that go into some of these tooling, the idiosyncratic nature of the bias is what frightens me a little bit. It's that it's not always a singular dimension. It's not always correlated or representative of human biases. It can go off the rails in different ways and can very quickly exacerbate. And we've seen that even with very simple algorithms. One of my favorite books, one of my favorite authors, is the book sort of The Weapons of Math Destruction that came out a few years ago. And it was fascinating how algorithms can create such dramatic bias. And so I'm very glad to see that there is a push for regulation in where AI can be applied in dangerous ways. And one of those areas is screening of candidates. We know that screening processes eliminate 90% of candidates. That's where you can get into very sticky territory. And so the New York City is regulating that. So when I think about how to use AI, I think we should be using AI to broaden the candidate pool. We should be using it to give opportunity and access to more people. And we should be being very careful of what are the data sets that algorithm has been trained on, so that we're not introducing all of these elements and variables. I'm kind of curious about both of your takes on that.
I'm going to give Rachel and Fountain a little bit of credit. I think this is what conversational does, right? If you think of traditionally what we would do, 100 people apply to a delivery person job in whatever city, the TA person would go, okay, 100 people. They would look at maybe 10 or 20. They would contact a handful and they would pass them on. 80% of those people never got a sniff. With the AI, all 100 will actually go through the full process, right? And the best people actually will come out of that. And then as long as we are controlling for, bias and all these other things, like, that's a 1,000,000,000% better than what we currently do, where some people get eliminated for no reason at all, just because they weren't the one that was at the top of the stack. There was an ATS, or not an ATS, it was a matching software. And we talk about early AI and some of the disadvantages, right? And it's moving so fast. I think that's where people don't understand either. AI 5 years ago is not AI today, right? But we try to act like, oh, this higher view thing is still out there. And you're like, no, it's not. It's not. So, but one of these early matching things in their algorithm, no one even like tested for, it would give the matches back in alphabetical order. Instead of, I mean, it was coming back with the top 25 people, but in alphabetical order. And 6 months later, they started to do like the testing.
I would, with my name, I would crush that.
The company was only, the company was only honoring A, B, and C's in the names.
Yes, finally.
Like Amit got hired every single time, and I never got hired. But we think we think that currently could happen, and it doesn't. It's not. That's not what we're at right now. We're way beyond that.
Yeah,
but there's also been. Go ahead, Rich.
More sophisticated too in terms of the type of testing that we do, right? Because the one question is, what data sets is AI trained on? And then the other question is, how does it respond in the real world? And I think overall, we have gotten much smarter in terms of like what type of testing we need to put it through and how rigorous we have to be. Learning more, essentially it's trial and error, right? Like 10 years ago, we learned a lot about what can go wrong if you don't test rigorously and if you don't keep an eye out for those things like an alphabetical sorting. And so we get smarter about how we use the tool, right, and how we test it. And then when it goes out into the wild, it is that much more equipped to help us make smart decisions.
That actually brings up, there's a really good question in the chat, which is, when will the hallucinations stop? It feels like we're describing ChatGPT as some sort of, as on drugs or something. It's just, when will the hallucinations stop? And I'm kind of fascinated. I don't think general purpose large language models will ever stop hallucinating. They don't. The question in my mind will be how effective, and it's just like thinking that driving a car will never not be dangerous in some way, shape, or form. It is a risk we take. What changes is, what is the level of safeguards and controls that we're able to create as a society that makes the risk tolerance fall within parameters that we are able to accept. And that is what I think was going to have to happen with AI regulation. It's all going to happen with AI training sets. It's like, what are the risks how do we as a community articulate what risks are, what the risk parameters are, and make sure that we can measure and manage that. It's one of the reasons why sort of we think of it in a very guardrailed approach. Like, how do we introduce AI elements into our app, into our user experience in ways that not only we feel are safe, but we feel that a user will use them in a safe and responsible way, as opposed to, hey, look, this is complete autopilot, everything, go wild. And that design paradigm can be very dangerous. Do you think there's been a shift in our mindset? I remember the early days of AI, and you'd use one of those matching examples, Tim. The early days of AI was this, I'm going to hand everything over to the AI and let the algorithm do its magic. And I think there's this new appreciation for this idea of assisted or augmented AI and augmented writing and augmented interviewing. That we're sort of, I think someone in the chat described it beautifully. We want the humans to be at the center of it, but it's like you're wearing an Iron Man suit that makes you more effective. Is that a design paradigm that's taken root in our industry?
I would say yes, absolutely, at least in the past couple of years in particular. But I think of it in a sense, going back kind of to the car analogy of, we put vehicles on the road. Everyone was so excited. The automobile exists. Took a long time to add seatbelts. Took a long time to add regulation, but that came about from learning. And as we become more educated about the risks, then overall as an industry, we take more of those steps to build out guardrails and to understand, okay, what parameters do I need to set as the human who is ultimately in control of this in order to get the results I want and in order to control an experience in such a way that it's going to be positive and achieve the outcomes that I'm looking for.
I love it. So let's get tactical. We have one more poll question, because the audience, I have to say, for as webinars go, this is a phenomenal audience. Thank you for keeping the chat alive, keeping all the questions and the ideas coming. So I'm gonna leverage you once again to tell us, what area do you hope AI will have the biggest impact in your work? I'm very curious what people say. What do you, what's your guess?
You know what I'm interested in is like on the interview side. Could you imagine like we do so many like kind of Zoom interviews and stuff now? Like if you could have that kind of AI interview assistant that when a candidate says something that doesn't jive with their resume, or they do that hesitation, or they're not, and to have a prompt come up that only you can see to say, hey, go back and ask this question, right? And again, I still have to make the decision. Do I want to ask that question? But so often we let those pass. Like we might feel like in my gut, I know I should have asked them that and I didn't. Then we hire them and you realize, oh, I made a bad hire because I was the dumb one not willing to ask the question. So I think there's so much advantage to like those kinds of assistants in our life, right?
I would even accept for interviewing a tool that makes sure that you ask the same consistent question for everybody.
Yeah.
So oftentimes, like, our mood of the day can have such a big difference in an interview panel and could create bias in the way we operate.
Yeah.
So we're getting some results. People are excited about automation, and I'm not surprised. My goodness, there is a lot that recruiters and TA professionals have to do that is manual, from pulling out CSVs from the ATS, from filling in scorecards. It is hard.
I think I'm most excited about the data, because I think right now we try to get BI, people in our teams. We try to get data analysis people in our teams. Like Rachel, you mentioned you have kind of that data science background. Like we always think we need that. The problem is it's really hard to get. It's really expensive to get. Whereas I think if we could have natural language to a computer and go, hey, I need to know what's our best source of hire by cost, blah, blah, blah. And then bam, it's there in seconds. I become a better TA leader. And right now, sometimes we're like, well, we can maybe get some, I don't know, we're not like, it's like the whole, like we're pulling data from different things. And then we sit down in the boardroom and, we try to give a data story and immediately our CFO blows us up and we feel like idiots, right? So we need to be better around data, but I think AI could really help us become experts around that.
Yeah, and I heartily agree. I was actually surprised we didn't get more of a response in the interpreting data. That's something I'm most excited about as well. And I think too, when we look at TA as a function and HR more broadly as a function, being able to shift from being viewed as sort of a transactional department from like days far gone by to a business operations department.
A truly strategic department.
Exactly. And having the data, the insights to back all of these things up, right? That's how we make the convincing arguments. That's what speaks most loudly and allows us to become most efficient.
And isn't it frustrating? Like today, it feels like in the last 4 years, we've had to have TA leaders become like data scientists, but without any of the tools, right? Like you ask a simple question and they've got to go download a CSV file and they got to like munge all this data. No one got into recruiting to do that. Like this is we continue to ask these insane questions of our TA teams and not provide tools. So there is this idea that can we elevate them? They're flooded with data. Can we actually give them insights?
No, and here what they do right now is like the CEO comes in and says, hey, it's the second quarter, fourth quarter, we're actually going to have to increase our hiring plan by 50%, which means you need an extra 500 hires. And we go, okay, we'll do it. Instead of going, wait, the data says we actually will fail if we try to do that. Here's what we need, X, Y, and Z to make it happen. If you're not going to give us that, understand we'll be 300 hires short of what your plan is. Right now, we just go, yeah, we'll work harder. We'll work 24/7. Like, that's not a strategy. That's
hustling is not a strategy.
Not a long-term
one, not a strategy, and
not a long-term strategy.
It is insane. One of the things I was really excited by was a few people answered they're excited about AI to expand the talent pool, to expand the hot candidate pool. And that is like a sea shift. If you asked 10 years ago, every single AI application was about shrinking the talent pool, about funneling and matching, about screening. And now we're asking a very different question, maybe because the markets have gotten so tight, is how do we use it to actually bring more people into the net, to identify talent pools that we haven't thought about, maybe people we've neglected, maybe categories of, and in effect, use it to interrogate our own biases as human beings. And so I'm very fascinated. I think that leaves me with a very optimistic view of the future, where we're starting to understand how we can use this tool for incredible good.
I'm going to disagree with you just a slight bit. One is I think it does expand potential of our pool candidates, but I still want AI to also be very rifle approach, right? I still want them to actually shrink it. The example I have is like, so StockX is a big online like shoe thing, right? I'm a sneakerhead, love sneakers. And I knew the head of TA, and I said, hey, I knew this kid going through high school, then going to college, who was a giant sneakerhead. I'm like, you got to get like, you need to hire these kinds of people. The thing is there's nothing that they would know unless that kid chose to act like opt in, to like, oh, I'm gonna go apply to be part of StockX. There's nothing that would actually go out and say, wait a minute, how do we go out to all these sneakerheads and figure out which ones actually have the skill sets to come and work here, right?
That's right.
So we are expanding where we might go, well, wait a minute, we're a tech company. We only want to look at tech people. And now they're going, wait a minute, what if we had people who loved our company and also had the skill sets? Wouldn't that be a better fit overall for potentially who we might be? I'm hopeful, right, that AI does that for us as well.
I hope so too. So we have 10 minutes left. And I want to ask 2 pointed questions to put you both on the spot. Question number 1, let's say you are a talent acquisition leader and your teams don't use any generative AI. You don't use ChatGPT. You don't have any tooling, but you're really curious and you want to start to incorporate it. Where do you begin? Like, what is step number 1, Tim and Rachel? How do you start?
Rachel, go ahead.
Sure. Step number 1, I would say step number 1 is to understand the problems you are trying to solve with AI and with ChatGPT. And that again goes back to this idea that journey versus destination. If you do not start out with a clear understanding of this is what we need to achieve that we either aren't achieving now or that we are not achieving to the best of our ability, efficiency, et cetera. Without that, it can lead very much into just shoehorning in like, we're going to try a chatbot or we're going to try and use AI to write job description. But if you can't answer why you're doing that, you also won't be able to tell if you're succeeding or not. So frankly, like at the very first foundational, like step 0, know the process you want to improve or the question you want to answer. And that will allow you to start figuring out which tools then are right to help you do that job.
That is fantastic.
I'll expand on that because I think I always tell people like you should be a super user of the technology you have first, right? So one, it would be to dig in like, hey, you're using this ATS and this sourcing machine and this analytics tool. Become super users of them and understand where's their journey of AI. And does that match that, back to Rachel's point, does that match the pain and process of where you want to go? If not, you better find some new tools for the landscape of where you're trying to go. But so often we go, oh, well, they have AI, I'm just going to jump over and do it. That, and you're like, well, wait a minute. Well, why, right? Why is that? Why should you do that? Or potentially maybe on the roadmap, your current technology is already planning to do that. They just have been bad about letting you know, right? So really dig in and find out what are you doing and why are you doing it within the landscape or the tech stack that we already have.
Yeah, last week I spoke to one of our customers who's future forward at the Get, and asked them, what are you doing? And how do you get your team so excited and motivated? And she gave me this fantastic idea. She says, every week at our talent acquisition meeting on Thursdays, the first 15 minutes we ask a question, what is the thing you hate doing the most? We ask people to kind of put out there, like, what is the thing that the part of your job that you truly detest? And then the second 15 minutes we spend asking, what are the latest tools that you're really excited about? Invariably, a lot of the new tools are around AI or building it in, and just elevating that conversation, giving her recruiters the ability and the permission to say, we don't need to be admin assistants. We can be more strategic. We can actually think about it. Then giving them the space to learn together has opened up all of these possibilities and avenues, and they've started incorporating more and more tooling. So thinking about that, I think it would be super important. So question number 2, let's say now you're a talent acquisition leader and you're evaluating a new vendor, and this vendor is giving you the promise of AI. And it's all these wonderful things that they're saying. And what questions should you be asking them? How do you go into this partnership eyes wide open? And Rachel, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You've been very, very thoughtful about the way you're building AI into Fountain. How should prospective customers sort of learn more about it?
Yeah. So the first question should be, upon what foundation has this been built? Like, what language models are you using? Where are you pulling from? What data has this model been trained on? And then the second question is, how have you tested it? And the how have you tested is so critical. And I would go so far as to ask, like, great, can you show me results of some of the tests. I want to see what happens when somebody misused it in the wildest possible way, right? Which is what, frankly, if you're bringing an AI tool to market, you should have folks who are trying to break it every way they can. And I think understanding what were the results of that is one of the most important things when you're going to be implementing it, especially because, you know, by nature, much of what we deal with is sensitive. It could be PII. And so you want to know, hey, when smart people tried to break this, what happened? What were the results of that? And then how did you mitigate the risk that came along once you discovered those things? So really understanding the process that went into what finally ended up in market and making sure that you're asking and looking for where the holes might be to poke through, because the right vendor is going to have answers to all of those questions that are going to satisfy your needs.
That makes a ton of sense. Tim, what about you?
Yeah. Two things. I want a documented either statement or policy around ethical AI. Where do you stand? And then the second one would be who's the third party auditor of your AI and your algorithm, right? And so, I mean, it's shocking that most of the AI vendors that are out there are espousing to be AI vendors have neither of those two things. They're just like, hey, we built a tool, it's awesome. Like, okay, that's great.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the third question that I would put out there is, do you send my data anywhere else? Because it is, a lot of tools are using, GPT or whatever else. Yeah. And what exactly are you sending them? And where does my data live? Where does my sensitive data live? It's such a critical point, because it's going to get only further exacerbated as we think about the regulatory frameworks we're entering.
It's a great, that we could do an entire webcast just on that, because that comment of question and data where it's sent, because I think every TA leader that you would talk with or every HR leader you talk with, they want benchmarking data, and the vendors aren't giving it to them because they're like, oh no, that's all proprietary data, this and that. You're like, no, again, I'm not giving you, if I'm working with Marriott, I'm not going to give you Hilton's data specifically, right? But like, I can give you industry data from our client base that's rolled up in a benchmark, and yet they don't do it. And I'm wondering why, because the buyer is desperate for it, and if anybody would actually do it. But part of that again is that question of going out and asking for permission to say, hey, if you opt in, and the other hundreds and thousands of clients we have opt in, we can give you amazing benchmark data that's going to make that story even better for you.
Well, I'll tell you part of the reason is it takes an enormous amount of effort, and as a technology company, to make sure that you are really separating and creating safeguards between sensitive and non-sensitive data, because the benchmark is almost always off of non-sensitive data.
For sure.
But it is not easy to manage, create the right data governance strategy, to create and keep it audited, to make sure that it's sort of run properly. And not every company does it. And that's another thing that you should be asking your vendors really hard on, is what is the level of maturity on their data privacy, and how effective are they in segregating those data sets and keeping them in managed really well. Well, we're right at time. This has been fantastic, and not least because the audience has been fantastic. All these ideas, all these questions, we're in these early innings of this entire new revolution, and we're going to get there by learning together. And I really appreciate everyone who shared. Tim and Rachel, I appreciate all of your learnings. This has been so much fun. I've learned a lot. And I bet we could have gone on for at least another 4 hours.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Easily. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week. Talk to you soon.